Well, we come this evening and consider the familiar gospel. The familiar gospel. Now, the gospel for some of us is very familiar. We have known it for a long time, and we have lived with it for a long time. But there is another way of using this word familiar. It is not a familiar which we should become contempt, but the familiarness of the relationship we have with God. There are, as we have said on previous occasions, no more distant points in all of the created sphere beyond the man and God. They are so far removed from one another, it is incredible. And yet, the privilege of the Christian is to call God, this far removed, distant being who is so distinct and different from us, Daddy. And I'm not being blasphemous. That's what the word Abba means. That simple, loving address that you addressed one person in your life, probably, or maybe you had other complicated situations, you might have named one or two. But it was reserved for someone particularly special. And there's a title that's given from those individuals. It's an amazing thing we're going to look at this evening. The text says, so you are no longer a slave but a son, and if a son, then an heir through, and we have in this translation here in front of us Christ, but the translation can comprehend God. Because really it's the whole work of the Trinity, isn't it? As well as Christ, both things being true. I wonder, as you look back, are you one of those people who says, the best years of my life were when I was at school? Some of us here disagree with that wholeheartedly. It was never the best years of our life. But some people say that, don't they? It was the best years of my life. I wonder why they say that, being one of those people who doesn't agree with that sentiment. I don't want to go back there. I got on all right. I got decent results, but I wouldn't want to go back. I suppose some people liked it because it was always regimented and ordered. It was always set in place. You knew what you were going to do every day, didn't you? And my life is very much not like that these days. But you knew what you were going to do. Monday morning comes, you see the kids tomorrow morning, they'll get up at a certain time, some of them will have breakfast, they'll get dressed into their uniform, they'll put their bags on their back or whatever they do, and they'll head off to school. 10 to 9, the bell will ring. At 9 o'clock, they'll go in for registration. At 10 past 9 or whatever, they'll be in their forms and they'll be talking about things. Then they'll go for assembly maybe. At 9:30, quarter to 10, they'll head off to classes. And so the day will progress through classes, breaks. And then finally that bell comes where you get to go home. And you go home, you do your homework, and then you go to bed. It's a very routine, regimented part of life. Some people like routine and regiment. There's something to be said for it in all of our lives, a bit of discipline. Some people like that. They like being told what to do and how to do it and what they should carry out. They like not having to make the decisions in life about what shall I wear today and how shall I look and how will people think of me and all the problems that can come with adulthood. Some people think they're the best years of their life. But Paul doesn't want us to go back. He wants us to move forward in our relationship. This is the familiar gospel, in which Paul presents and shows the process and the outcome of God's adoption. The process and the outcome of God's adoption. He shows how it has worked out and how it moves forward in this passage, and he shows the outcome of it, what God has brought us into. And it's important we have those two things in focus, it seems, as Paul does it. So as we look at it, we want to see the familiar links which move us closer to God. Adoption moves us out of where we were into something amazing. That's why Paul doesn't want us going backwards and say, well, the best years of my life were back there somewhere. In the Christian's experience, the best years of our life are still to come. There's a greatness and a wonder into which God is bringing us, and it's tied into this process and outcome which Paul demonstrates for us here. So let's look at the familiar principle, the thing that is laid out in front of us in this text. I mean then that an heir, as long as he is a child, begins Paul, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. And remember, Paul has dealt in part with this in the previous section. There's always a difficulty when you go through Galations, because Paul often repeats things and brings things through. But he is developing it. He told us last week we were once under the law, But now we have the promise, and the law is not like the promise. The law is just a guardian there for a temporary time. The promise brings us forward. And now he takes back to that theme again. He speaks of us as being children. He speaks to the Galatians as being like a child. This is the illustration. Here is a man. He has his will in line. He is the owner of an estate or something, and he has it ready. And when the child is ready, he will be able to take it up. But as long as he's a child, he's just like another person in the household. He doesn't have any authority. He doesn't have any life. He's just there. In fact, this child is under guardians and managers who seem to have more authority than he does. They look after him. While they're a baby or a young child, they're cared for their food, their clothing. They don't have to make decisions about what they're going to wear or what they're going to look like. They're just looked after. In matters of finance, there's someone to look after the monies and all the issues that they need not to worry about. They're just like a slave. They don't seem to have any basis. But he mentions something here, but that goes on not throughout all their life, but until a point where the father says, right, here it is. When he's reached this stage in life, those guardians and managers won't be needed anymore. And this son can come forth and he can take up responsibility in my household. And he can take over. This is the picture. We've seen part of that picture. I'll explain a bit more of that maybe a little later on. The comparison, then Paul takes this illustration and he applies it to the Galatian situation. He said, well, before we were Christians, we were like that child. We were under guardians and managers. That's what he called the law a little earlier on. But what it really applies to here is what he calls elementary principles. That doesn't sound very good in our English language, but if you were to transfer that into American English, which isn't proper English, is it? There's no Americans here tonight, say that, can I? It's different. In America, you have not primary schools or foundation schools, you have elementary schools. That's right, isn't it? Yes, elementary schools. They teach the basics. You remember the basics? 2 plus 2, 4. And all of those basics, A, B, C, D, E, I'm not going any further with that one. And all of those things that you learned, they were the basics. You were taught those things in order that you might have a basic grasp of how mathematics works and how you might know how to write and explain yourself. You were taught a bit of science and a bit of geography. At least they tried to teach us a bit. Some of you older ones were even taught some practical things like how to hold a hammer and a screwdriver and a needle and a thread. There was all kinds of basic things you were taught in life. But there was a point which they were the elementary. But there was a point at which you went beyond the elementary. You didn't let go of the elementary. I mean, I still know what 2 plus 2 is. And I still know what the ABCs are. But I don't keep going referring back to that anymore. I've gone beyond it. I've moved forward. And so the Galatians. For a time, this world taught you the basics. And it's all it can ever teach you. The only thing it could ever teach any individual is the basics. It can only teach them the 2 plus 2 and the ABCs. But when God had set the time, He brought us out from under the basics. So now I want you to see how those basics apply in the real world. My world. The greatness of what I'm doing. The point at which Paul points out to the Galatians this took place was not when men had learned enough, because men can never learn enough. But the time which he points to is the time when Jesus Christ came. He points out that Jesus came into the world at the fullness of time, at the right time, at the appropriate time. By the time we think about that a bit further, it is a key point of history. It is an amazing time in history. Everything falls into place. It is the time when the gospel can spread so quickly through the Roman Empire with all of its means. Can go out in so many ways. There are so many things we know of the fullness of time. But also, it is the combination of times as fulfilling the Scriptures. You know, the system of crucifixion didn't exist for very long. It wasn't really used in the way it was used by the Romans for very long. It was at the right time. It was at the appropriate time, the full time. It's really the focus of what happened here. God sent forth His Son. He tells us two things about this. He was born of a woman, and He was born under the law. Born according to the promise which He spoke of last week. The promise made in Genesis 3:15, where God said that of the seed of the woman, the Son would come forth and He would bruise. He speaks of that, but He also speaks of one coming under the law. He speaks of one coming to join us in school. That's an amazing comprehension, and we looked at it a bit on Wednesday evening, but let's dig back there a little further. It doesn't hurt to go back. In the book of Luke, he's the only one to mention this. At the age of 12, we're told of an account of Jesus' life. He's taken up to the temple in Jerusalem. There he is, a young boy. He's just the same as some of us were as young boys, only better behaved. He's without sin. He has subjected himself to the teachings of his parents. They've brought him up in all the basics and elementary things of life. As he sits there with the people in the temple, his parents have headed off home, as they're known of in this world, and he is sitting there talking with the leaders of the people. They're amazed. He's asking questions and giving answers that they just don't see how it's possible for a 12-year-old boy to be working out. But he's got it nonetheless. He tells his parents when they come looking for him that he is about his father's business. And why were they worrying in the first place? It's the first time we get a glimpse of Jesus speaking with his parents and really showing who he is. We know he is from all that's come before, yet there it is. And yet we find something remarkable following that, though showing he is distinct and different, and he knows things, and he is beyond, and he is God himself. We read, and he subjected himself to them. He went home and subjected himself to them. That doesn't mean he put himself under pain with them, but rather he became obedient to his parents. Why did he do that? Because that's what God's law stated he should do. He put himself under the law. He put himself under the basic elementary teachings of this world. He placed himself in our little classroom. But he sent him into this world not only to be born of woman, under the law, come into our classroom, but to redeem us, to buy us back. See, though he subjected himself to be in our position, he wasn't like us in the matter that really is at the core of our being and why we're so broken and ruined. He was without sin. He was priceless. He was perfect. He is perfect. He is the priceless gem of all eternity. He is the pearl of greatest price. He is the glorious one. But rather than showing off his glory for his own purpose, he rather hid and veiled that glory that he might pay the price that was needed to be paid to buy us back. See, he wasn't Joseph's son, was he? He was God's son. He was born of a woman, but he wasn't born of a man. He was God's gift to redeem, to buy us back. But not merely to buy us back that we might be slaves. We were already that. We were slaves to God, slaves in this world under the system of God. But that we might receive adoption. That we might become the children of God. We know what adoption is. To be brought into a family to which we are not physically connected. There's no bloodline. There's nothing that links us. We are so different, God and us. We are vast apart. We are separated by sin. Our iniquities have separated us. There is nothing flowing through us that can really be said. We were made in his image and we had his breath, but sin had so spoiled us that nothing in us was uncorrupted. But God has brought us into a family to which we are physically unconnected, yet into a reality which is spiritually connected. For what did He do to show this redemption and bring this redemption? He sent His Spirit into our hearts. See, people say, well, I'm a Christian because of the things I do, and the Bible knows nothing of that. We're a Christian because God sent His Spirit into our hearts. And we know that God has changed and transformed our relation to Him. There are many people who behave a lot better than Christians and do a lot of things in this world that would exceed us and put us to shame. But they're not Christians. Because those who are Christians are those which Christ has come into the world, placed Himself in their place, and the Spirit of Him has come into their hearts. And where this has happened, says Paul, the change has taken place. You were once slaves, learning the elementary things of this world. But now God has taken you out of the classroom and taken you home as His Son. And if you are a son, then you're the heir of God. Galatians get the point. Law couldn't do this for you, but God has brought you into relation with Him. That you can call Him this wonderful name, Dad. That's a name that doesn't mean a lot in this world today. Dad's someone you shout at. Dad's someone you're disappointed with. Dad's someone who's broken and ruined. Dad's the failures. I don't know. I'm a dad and I'm a failure. Now, some of you don't like that word, I know, but you know what I mean. I could do better. And I know that. But when you think of God, you have to forget what you know of Dad in this world. And you have to look to the glory of what God has brought us into. Relation. Let me illustrate it. The point is made for the passage. You can go over that yourself again. It's a familiar process. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. In my previous life, and that's not that I have lived again or been reincarnated, it's just what I did before, I was a carpenter, as many of you know. One of the privileges I had was to work for some very wealthy people. Sometimes that wasn't a privilege, but sometimes it was. One of the individuals I worked for had a very large estate. When he was a young boy, I don't know how I learned this, but I learned it from someone around at the time I was working with him. When he was born, his grandfather did something that your grandfathers didn't do for you. I don't mean that as anything against your grandfathers, but I don't think any of you are millionaires. But when he was born, his grandfather put £1 million into his account. Gives you an idea of how much money now is involved in this family. This family had a vast estate. In fact, they own quite a large chunk of France. They have a centre part of London they own, and I don't mean in the suburbs of the centre, I mean right in the centre. They own quite a large amount of property there. They own a village down south somewhere. And I was working on a small little farm, and it was a small little farm in comparison with all they owned in the midst of Suffolk. Now, when this boy was a boy, he had £1 million in his bank. Do you think a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old had any idea? No. No one said to him, now, what would you like for sweets or doing and all these things? What did they do? Well, they put him under supervision. For the first years of his life, his mum and dad cared for him, probably a nanny, because that's what wealthy people can afford. And in the business of looking after an estates and all of these things, it would be necessary to do that. So this young boy was brought up and educated in the best he could. But he was always being educated for a purpose. See, the hope was that this boy would grow up and he would take responsibility for chateaux in France and buildings in London and farms and estates. And so he was educated. He went to school like I did. Probably better teachers, but nevertheless he went to school and he learned 2 plus 2 and he learned his ABCs. He learned his trigonometry and he learned his geography. He learned all those things. He passed his exams and he did. But they still didn't give him responsibility for combines and tractors and houses and estates. He had to learn. He went to university and he developed in his learning. And he learned the basic principles of how things go together and do. But he still didn't get responsibility. As he grew up and he left the university, he then entered into the family business. But he didn't know anything about it, really. He knew all of these things existed and all these places. He'd visited them and been around them. As yet, he wasn't aware of the inward workings of the family business. And so he was taken under the wing of individuals, and managers and individuals brought him alongside, and they started to show him. Now he'd grown up knowing he had £1 million in the bank, but now he understood that the things around him had a lot more value than he thought. Tractors run into hundreds of thousands of pounds and combines into more than that. Lands and castles and employments and all of these things, they all have to be accounted for. And the boy learned that 2 plus 2 had a lot more meaning when it came to wages and payments and taxes and shares and all of these things. Eventually it came to the point, a time set, when he had learned all he needed to know and he was acquainted with everything that was there, and responsibility was handed over to him. Son, it is all yours. He's now one of the wealthiest people in this country. He now has responsibility for paying wages, and he now has his own children who he's teaching 2 plus 2 and bringing through the elementary things of life so that they can take responsibility for the things that he was given. We understand that. We sort of see that, don't we? The Queen of England does the same with her son, and her son does the same with his son. His son will do the same with their son. Their responsibility is the education. The thing in that illustration, the problem we often think is we can learn to do this. But God teaches us the basics. And then he brings us out into something that just blows our mind. And something which he's not going to hand over responsibility to us in, but something he brings us out to see what is his and to be a part of. In the Christian life, before we were Christians, we knew what was right and what was wrong in a very basic way. We knew not to commit adultery and not to steal. We knew that we were to have the Lord our God as our only God. We knew the basics. But when we were saved, we were brought into the family business, as it were. The Father took us out from under the managers and the supervisors, and he said, now come to me with work. Let me show you what I am and who I am. Oh, and by the way, this is all yours. This vastness of the universe which I have created, I've made it for you. I've made it you may enjoy my love and my benefits, but I've also made it that you may have something to do. I've got a role for you to play in all that I'm doing. I've got something you should take responsibility for. I've brought you out and adopted you as my son that you may follow in the family line and business of salvation and of relation, of working with me. It was God's knowledge and not ours that knew that we were saved, and it was God that chose us when we were enslaved to bring us into this relation. What a wonderful thing for this man who I described earlier on. To know as a young boy he was growing up and to watch his dad at work. And then one day to actually find that he's actually in his dad's shoes. You'll never find that. God's bigger than this. But it's a wonder that we have such a relationship with God that we can talk in terms of father and son, working hand in hand and laboring together, talking with that familiarity which we use in that word, daddy, which I never called anyone else in this world but one man. And I will never call anyone else by that name, except I know I have that familiarity with God. A familiar then process we see, we understand. But what about a familiar possession? Because you have sent your God's sons, God has sent His Spirit in your hearts crying, Abba, Father. There's a need in our lives, friends, to move on from the basics. When I was a child, I did as a child, says Paul, but when I was a man, I put away childish things. As I said earlier, we don't move on from 2 plus 2, do we? We don't say, oh, I don't need that anymore. I don't need 2 plus 2 anymore. I don't need to know that the angles of a triangle add up to whatever they add up to, and the center, the angles, and all these things that we learn. I don't need that. Yes, you need it. It was taught you as the basics. But you bring that forward into something greater and something more wonderful. When God gave us the law, He wasn't teaching us nonsense we didn't need to know. We needed to know the basics of all the things we should do, but He brings us forward into something more. So instead of now worrying about not committing adultery, God tells us to think about how we live our marriages in the light of our relation to Him. Do not commit adultery is just a basic law. But it doesn't lay out the fullness of all God can do in our marriages. Do not steal is a basic principle of how we should respond to other people's things. But it doesn't bring us into the fullness of what God wants us to do. Treasure what you have been given by me. Love the possessions you have. Develop them. Do not envy what others have, is a basic principle. But rather delight in the things that you have is a greater thing. Men have to be protected from one another in basic principles because we're greedy, sinful beings. But the children of God possess in Christ riches that are out of this world. And they're told to move beyond the basics, but take the basics with them and develop. I wonder if there's anything in your life you can think of and you're still living by the 10 Commandments as a set of basic rules, but you're not living in the fullness of what you possess. You're so worried about breaking the basics, you're like a child playing at 2 plus 2 and making sure he doesn't forget his times tables, rather than really seeing the beauty of what they can develop into. How foolish it would be for a man to keep worrying about his times tables when he has the brains to be an architect and design buildings. How foolish for us to keep practicing our sewing when we have children to clothe and we could make them clothing. There are basics we can transfer in life, and so it is in the spiritual life. God doesn't mean for us to keep playing at the basics, but to develop as children. Part of this is to take up our responsibilities. You have gifts. God taught you the basics of your gifted life. Some of you are great entertainers. I don't mean that by people standing on stages. I mean you use your homes and you're caring and you're loving. It's a gift to be developed. It's a gift that can be a blessing. Something that God has given you to use. We have abilities in life which we learnt the basics in this world. They taught us how to be good at our employment and jobs, but God can take us beyond just being good at them and being useful at them in our life with Him. Some of the parables Jesus told in the New Testament were about good stewards, to whom was given 5 talents, 10 talents, and so on. And each of them was to use them and to work. God has so gifted us. The world taught us the basics. But in relation with God, we can learn to do so much more with it. A meal becomes more than just feeding people when God's involved, doesn't it? It becomes about fellowship. It becomes about talking about Christ and the things of our experience. It becomes more than showing off the latest cutlery at the table. It becomes about relationship. All these things can be developed. Why? Because God took us out of classroom and brought us into relation. And that relation is lived out in practice. We need to recognize the privilege of this relation. I don't know the figures, and I don't think anyone on the planet knows the figures, for the amount of children that live in this world presently who do not know their father and mother. I know that in the Lancashire area, and I mean just down the coast of Blackpool and down to Preston, There are some 1,800 children on the waiting list for adoption and fostering even this evening. There are an awful lot of people in this world who don't know what it is to have a dad. But the beauty of the Christian relationship, we will never be out without one. A Father in heaven. I looked up to my dad. I still do. He's in heaven now, so I have to look up to him, don't I? He's in glory. He was a bright man, an ordinary man. He could do things with his hands and things, and I looked up to him. I always admired him. But he never compared with my real dad, the God of heaven. My dad could make greenhouses and he could build things. The God of heaven made the world with his breath. He spoke a word and it came into being. My own dad, he had to let me go out of the door and do my own thing, and he could never watch over me. But the dad who really is in the relation we're talking about tonight never loses sight of me. He took me out of the hands of guardians years ago and said, walk with me and come with me and I will show you great things. The privilege of our relation with God. You were once slaves to elementary things. You were once children in school. And now you've been brought alongside your Heavenly Father. Let us conclude. The question is really, do you want to be back behind the desk? Or do you want to be spending time with Dad? They have these dads at work days now, don't they? And go to work with Mum. You can either be in your relationship with God as sort of, well, we come to church to be told by God what we're going to do. And you see this as a kind of mini classroom. There's the blackboard. Here's the lectern, and there you're sitting at desks. And you're there to learn and to take in, and you just want to get the basics. But that's not what church is about, and it's not what God has saved us to, is it? He doesn't want us back at school. He rather wants us spending time with Him. That's very different. To watch the wonder of Him at work. The wonder of Him working in other people's lives and the wonder of Him working in our lives. As He talks and works in the lives of individuals, so often we can become a part of that because He's adopted us into His family. So someone is ill and we get to ring up and to encourage them. Sometimes we're neglectful of that, but we're thankful for those who do it. There may be individuals who need support and prayer, and we pray. Why? Because our Father cares, and we've watched Him care, so we care. And we become a part of what He is doing as a son. You are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir. That's important. At school, you didn't have any interest in the fabric and building of the place. It was just performing a function. You can't say that of church. You are the church. You're an heir of this. This is part of you. This belongs to you. These people around you are your family. And one day you're going to be part with them for eternity. But you have responsibility for it now. If you're a son, then you're an heir through God. He cares for them. You should be caring for them. Back behind a desk, it was about what can I learn and what can I do, and having a routine and system to your life. Being with Dad kind of ruins that because dads tend to take a very open view to things. Well, let's just see how it goes today, son. Come with me. Well, maybe we'll do this and maybe we'll do that. I've noticed that God rarely works according to a plan that a man forms. He's often appears, though He isn't. More of a free thinking. Because He takes us out of our comfort zones and does things with us that we don't particularly find enjoyable in the first moment, but we see the reasoning for it afterwards. Dads do things like picking us up and throwing us in the air, scaring us half to death, and then catching us. Sometimes our Father in heaven does that with us. But other times He sits us on our knees, His knee, and makes us feel loved. He wouldn't do that with a slave. but He does it with you. Abba, Father. When was the last time you really called God Dad? You addressed Him in a familiar, face-to-face, ordinary way. Not in a demeaning way. Don't mistake this. God is not our buddy or our pal. He is not someone we talk down to, like men talk to their dads in this world. He must always be held in honor and esteem for who He is. But He has chosen to let us call Him by familiar terms, that we may appreciate the greatness of the relationship we have. I hope you don't want to go back to school tonight. Tomorrow is a week in which you're going to go with Dad, and you're going to watch Him at work. And may you work with Him as you see Him labor in your life, through your life, towards those around you. I will conclude with this, sorry. I've come to so many conclusions. But there was a man in the Old Testament, his name is Enoch. And if you think of your relationship and your walk with God, this child's description of walking with Enoch might help you. You remember Enoch in Genesis 5:24, he said to walk with God, and he was not because God took him. This is a child's description of what happened when he was telling his parent about this when he got home. What did you do today at Sunday school, son? Oh, we learned about Enoch. What did you learn about Enoch? Well, Enoch walked with God. And he was walking with God so closely and so long one day that God said to Enoch, you know, we're closer to my home than your home, Enoch. Why don't you come home with me? That's very familiar, isn't it? And very simple. And yet in our walk with God, that's exactly what's going to happen with us one day. We're going to be nearer to His home than our home, and He's going to say to us, come home. Come home. Because He's Dad. That's what He's done.